Hello everyone, you are listening to Uncomfortable Truths with Euclid Phoenix, where I talk about politics, religion, and other BS that I find interesting. Today for politics, we will take a look at a couple of presidents. James Monroe, the good, the bad, and the legacy of America's fifth president. When Americans think about the founding era presidents, names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln usually dominate the conversation. But James Monroe, America's fifth president, is often overlooked. And yet Monroe helped shape some of the most important ideas in early American history, especially in foreign policy. His presidency gave rise to the famous Monroe Doctrine, which expanded American territory and oversaw a period that became known as the Era of Good Feelings. But Monroe's legacy was also deeply tied to some of the contradictions of early America: slavery, Native American displacement, political inequality, and growing sectional tensions that would eventually erupt into civil war. In this episode, we're going to explore who James Monroe was, what he accomplished, and where his presidency succeeded, where it failed, and how history should remember him today, because many early American leaders, Monroe's story is a mixture of achievement and contradiction. The early life and revolutionary roots. James Monroe was born in Virginia in 1758. Unlike some later presidents who entered politics through law or business, Monroe came of age during the American Revolutionary itself. As a young man, he joined the Continental Army and fought under George Washington. He was even wounded during the Battle of Trenton. This experience deeply shaped Monroe's worldview. He became part of the generation that saw itself as creating an entirely new political experiment, a republic based on liberty rather than monarchy. Monroe later studied law under Thomas Jefferson, who became one of his political mentors, and like Jefferson, Monroe strongly supported states' rights, agrarianism, democracy, and skepticism towards centralized federal power. The Era of Good Feelings. James Monroe became president in 1817 after the War of 1812. At the time, the United States was entering a period of rising nationalism and political unity. The Federalist Party had largely collapsed, leaving Monroe's Democratic Republican Party dominant. This period became known as the Era of Good Feelings. Under Monroe, the country experienced westward expansion, economic growth, reduced partisan conflict, increasing national confidence. Monroe also traveled widely throughout the country, helping create the image of a president connected to ordinary Americans rather than a distant elite. Compared to some earlier presidents, Monroe appeared less ideological and more focused on national unity. The Monroe Doctrine. Monroe's most famous achievement was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. At the time, many Latin American countries were gaining independence from European colonial powers. The United States feared European nations might attempt to reestablish control of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine declared that European interference in the Americas would be viewed as a threat to the United States. In simple terms, Europe should stay out of the Americas. The Americas were no longer open to colonization. At first, the doctrine was more symbolic than military enforceable. The United States was still relatively weak compared to European powers. But over time, the Monroe Doctrine became one of the most influential principles in American foreign policy. Supporters view it as protecting independence in the Western Hemisphere, resisting colonial domination, asserting American sovereignty. Critics argue it later became justification for American interventionism, imperial influence, interference in Latin America. So even Monroe's greatest achievement carries long-term controversy. Territorial expansion in Florida. Monroe's presidency also saw major territorial growth. In 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty allowed the United States to acquire Florida from Spain. This was viewed as a major diplomatic success. Expansion strengthened America's geographically and economically. But westward expansion also came with serious consequences. Native American tribes increasingly faced displacement, broken treaties, military pressure. This pattern had already begun before Monroe, but it continued during his presidency and expanded further afterward. Like many leaders of his era, Monroe generally viewed American expansion as both inevitable and desirable. And from the perspective of native peoples, expansion often meant loss of land, autonomy, and life. Slavery and the Missouri Compromise. One of the biggest issues facing Monroe's presidency was slavery. By the early 1800s, tensions between free states and slave states were growing rapidly. The crisis exploded over Missouri's request to join the Union as a slave state. This led to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state, admitted Maine as a free state, admitted to limit slavery's expansion geographically. Supporters believed the compromise temporarily pressured the Union, and in the short term, it probably did. But critics argue it merely delayed a deeper moral and political crisis. Monroe himself owned slaves and did not fundamentally challenge the institution of slavery. This remains one of the major moral criticisms of both Monroe and many of the founding era leaders. Like Jefferson and Madison, Monroe spoke about liberty and participating in a system that denied liberty to others. That contradiction means central to evaluating the legacy honestly. Economic problems and criticism. Although Monroe's presidency is often remembered positively, it was not without problems. One major issue was the Panic of 1819, America's first major economic depression. The crisis caused bank failures, unemployment, falling land values, financial instability. Many ordinary Americans suffered economically. Critics argued Monroe's administration responded too slowly and lacked effective economic solutions. This period also exposed tensions between federal power, banking systems, regional economic interests, issues that would continue shaping American politics for decades. The good and the bad. So how should we evaluate James Monroe? The good. Monroe helped stabilize the young republic during an uncertain period. His accomplishments included strengthening national identity, reducing partisan conflict, expanding U.S. territory, establishing the Monroe Doctrine, and navigating post-war nationalism. Compared to some presidents, Monroe was viewed as relatively modest and less personally divisive. His presidency represented a period of confidence and consolidation for the United States. The bad, but Monroe's presidency reflected many of early Americans' contradictions. These included support for slavery, Native American displacement, expansionism, limited democratic inclusion, failure to confront deeper sectional tensions, and while the era of good feelings sounds peaceful, many underlying national problems were simply being postponed rather than solved. The tensions surrounding slavery especially would eventually erupt into the Civil War. Monroe's historical legacy. Today, historians generally rank Monroe as an above-average president, not because he transformed America dramatically, but because he helped preserve and stabilize the nation during a critical period. His influence on foreign policy through the Monroe Doctrine was enormous. At the same time, modern readers increasingly evaluate presidents not just by political success, but by ethics, inclusion, human consequences. And that creates a more complicated picture. Monroe helped shape America's rise, but like many early leaders, he also benefited from systems that excluded and oppressed others. Conclusion: James Monroe represents both the promise and the contradictions of early America. He helped strengthen the Republic, he promoted national unity, he expanded American influence, but his presidency also existed within slavery, territorial expansion, inequality, and unresolved moral tensions. In many ways, Monroe's story reflects the larger American story itself. Ambition mixed with contradiction, ideals mixed with exclusion, liberty mixed with limitation. Understanding figures like Monroe honestly means resisting both blind celebration and simplistic condemnation. History is usually more complicated than either extreme. Understanding history isn't about pretending historical figures were perfect. It's about understanding how their decisions shaped the world we inherited today. Now on John Quincy Adams, brilliant statesman or frustrated president. John Quincy Adams is often remembered as one of the smartest men ever to become president of the United States. He spoke multiple languages, served as a diplomat across Europe, helped shape American foreign policy, and played a major role in defining America's relationship with the rest of the world. And yet, despite all of his intelligence and experience, his presidency is ranked as unsuccessful or deeply troubled. Why? Part of the answer lies in politics. Part of it lies in personality, and part of it lies in growing divisions needed inside America itself. In this episode, we'll explore the life and the presidency of John Quincy Adams, his accomplishments, his failures, his complicated personality, and why many historians today view him more favorably than people did during his presidency. Because Adams may have been one of the most capable presidents America ever had, while also being one of the least politically effective. The son of a founder, John Quincy Adams was born in 1767, the son of America's second president, John Adams. From a young age, he lived inside the world of diplomacy and revolution. As a child, he even witnessed parts of the American Revolution firsthand. Unlike many politicians who built popularity through charisma, Adams became known for intellect, discipline, education, and diplomacy. He studied at Harvard and became fluent in several languages. By his teenage years, he was already serving as diplomatic assistant in Europe. This gave Adams an unusually international worldview for an early American leader. He saw America not just as a new nation, but as a nation that needed to survive among powerful empires. A diplomatic genius. Before becoming president, Adams built one of the most impressive diplomatic careers in American history. He served as ambassador to several European countries, senator, Secretary of State under James Monroe. Many historians actually consider Adams one of America's greatest secretaries of state. One of his biggest achievements was helping shape the Monroe Doctrine. Although James Monroe announced the doctrine publicly, Adams was one of its key architects. The doctrine warned European powers against further colonization in the Americas and became one of the defining principles of U.S. foreign policy. Adams also helped negotiate territorial agreements, trade relationships, diplomatic stability. At a time when the United States was still relatively young and vulnerable. In many ways, Adams excelled in long-term strategic thinking. The election of 1824 and the corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams became president after one of the most controversial elections in American history. In the election of 1824, no candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. The decision went to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson had won the most popular votes and electoral votes, but not enough to secure victory outright. The House ultimately chose Adams. Soon afterward, Adams appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters immediately accused Adams and Clay of making a secret deal, the so-called corrupt bargain. Whether or not an actual corrupt agreement existed remains debated, but politically the damage was enormous. Many Americans believed Adams had unfairly taken the presidency, and Andrew Jackson's supporters spent the next 4 years attacking Adams relentlessly. Adams' vision for America. As president, Adams had an ambitious vision for national development. He supported roads, canals, scientific advancement, education, national infrastructure. He believed the federal government should help modernize and strengthen the country. In some ways, Adams was ahead of his time. He promoted a national university, scientific research, improved transportation systems, economic development. Today, some historians view many of these ideas as forward-thinking, but at the time, critics accused Adams of expanding federal power too much. Opponents, especially supporters of Andrew Jackson, argued that Adams represented elite government disconnected from ordinary citizens. Why Adams struggled as president. Despite his intelligence, Adams struggled politically. One major reason was personality. Adams was highly intelligent, disciplined, serious, but he was not charismatic. He disliked political maneuvering and often came across as cold or arrogant. In an era when American politics was becoming more populist and emotional, Adams seemed increasingly out of step. Andrew Jackson, by contrast, projected strength, emotion, and populist appeal. Adams also faced constant destruction from political opponents. Much of his agenda stalled in progress. As a result, many people viewed his presidency as ineffective, even though some of his ideas would later influence future American development. Slavery and moral complexity. Like many early American leaders, Adams' relationship to slavery is complicated. Unlike several previous presidents, Adams became increasingly outspoken against slavery later in his life. After losing the presidency, he served in the House of Representatives for nearly 2 decades. There he became one of the most prominent anti-slavery voices in Congress. He fiercely opposed the gag rule, which prevented anti-slavery petitions from being discussed. Adams argued that suppressing debate threatened constitutional freedoms. He also defended enslaved Africans involved in the famous Amistad case before the Supreme Court. This became one of the defining moments of his later career. However, Adams was not fully modern in his racial views either. Like many people of his era, some of his views still reflected limitations and prejudice common to the 19th century. But compared to many other political leaders of his time, Adams became increasingly willing to challenge slavery publicly. The good and the bad. So how should we evaluate John Quincy Adams? The good. Adams was highly intelligent, deeply experienced, committed to public service, an extraordinary diplomat. His accomplishments included helping shape the Monroe Doctrine, expanding American diplomacy, supporting science and infrastructure, defending free speech, opposing slavery later in life. Many historians admire Adams for prioritizing long-term national development over short-term popularity. The bad, but Adams also struggled with political effectiveness, elitist image, weak public connection, instability to build strong coalitions. His presidency accomplished far less than he hoped, and critics argued he represented an older style of politics increasingly disconnected from democratic populism. Even some of his good ideas failed politically because he could not persuade enough people to support them. Adams' historical legacy. Today, historians often separate Adams the president from Adams the statesman. As president, he is usually ranked somewhere in the middle, but as a diplomat and public servant, many historians consider him exceptional. His post-presidential career especially strengthened his legacy. Few former presidents returned to public office the way Adams did, and even fewer became leading moral voices afterward. In some ways, Adams' greatest contributions may have happened after he left the White House. Conclusion. John Quincy Adams was one of the most intellectually gifted leaders in American history, but intelligence alone does not guarantee political success. Adams envisioned a stronger, more educated, and more developed America. Some of his ideas were ahead of their time, but he struggled to connect emotionally with the growing democratic energy of the country. At the same time, his later opposition to slavery helped place him on a different moral trajectory than many earlier presidents. Like many historical figures, Adams was neither hero nor villain. He was a complicated man living through deeply complicated period of history. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the podcast and sharing it with others interested in American history, politics, philosophy, leadership, religion, historical analysts. And remember, some leaders are remembered not because they were the most popular, but because history eventually recognizes the depth of their ideas and convictions. Check out my website in the notes along with my Patreon page.